Well, thanks for joining in on our first function for the year in this virtual meetings program at the time of pandemic, and we're starting 2021 with a discussion on Australian politics 2021, and we've got two commentators, both of whom have spoken previously at the Institute. We'll lead off with Aaron Patrick, who, as you know, is a senior correspondent for the AFR, the author of a number of books, most recently A Surprise Party, for which he addressed the Sydney Institute on the 2019 federal election, and Parnell McGuinness, who is a business owner running in the area of strategic communications, a columnist for 9 newspapers, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Sun Herald in Sydney, and their like papers in Melbourne. So we lead off with Aaron, we go to Parnell, and then we go to question and discussion, and thanks to our members for sending in some questions which we'll deal with later. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and thanks for tuning in, and thank you very much to the Sydney Institute for inviting me to speak on the topic of politics in 2021. It's a pleasure to be here with my good friend Parnell McGuinness at one of Australia's preeminent political discussion forums. And it's also great to catch up with Anne and Jared Henderson too. I don't see Jared as much as I would like to these days. He used to bring a different perspective to my Sunday mornings and is sadly missed. I have good news though. 2021 is going to be an exciting year in politics. We could have a leadership challenge on one side, and we could even have a general election. Even if there isn't an election, the ground will be prepared for one. And a moment could also come when Australians realise that COVID is not going away and the pandemic is going to be an endemic. Now, this is going to have major political implications for the year ahead. And it will be fascinating to see how that goes down, especially if Victorians are told that they're going to have to effectively welcome the virus back in because there is no way to keep it out forever. Now, vaccines, something I'd like to talk a little bit about because it's going to be so important for the year ahead. Vaccines generally don't reduce symptoms of any disease. A few like the polio vaccine sterilise the recipient, but there is a strong chance that the vaccines currently under development for COVID-19 are not going to stop it from spreading. Even if they do to a certain extent, more than 80% of the population may have to be vaccinated to achieve herd immunity. Now there's a phrase we haven't heard of for a long time, herd immunity. 9 months ago, anyone who proposed herd immunity as a solution to the pandemic was practically marched into the town square, put in stocks, and pelted with rotten tomatoes. Now, as vaccines are rolled out, herd immunity is the global solution. But because these new strains we've seen emerging are so virulent, experts reckon they may require an extra 10 to 20% of the population to be inoculated before we can get the pandemic to die out of its own accord. Now this would translate to 85% of people above the age of 12 or more requiring vaccines. But there is always a residual proportion of the population who don't want to be vaccinated. And in this case, vaccines will be optional. Some sociologists reckon about a third of Australians are unlikely to sign up. So this gap between what we have to do to kill off the virus or stop the pandemic and what's likely to happen is going to pose the most pressing challenge for Australian governments in 2021. Now, for the past year, the states and federal government on both sides of politics have done a great job at convincing voters that they are doing a great job at suppressing the virus. They've done such a good job that we've almost eliminated COVID-19. And yesterday was the 9th day of no cases of community transmission across the country, which is truly phenomenal on a global scale. This should be cause for celebration. But the paradox is that it's made it harder to achieve herd immunity and take us out of the pandemic. There are credible estimates that the number of infected people in America is around 100 million, which is almost a third of the population and dwarfs the official estimates in Australia of 30,000. Even if the true number infected in Australia is topping 100,000, we are nowhere near the levels of other countries have let it rip. But we can't keep our borders shut forever, and I'm not convinced the 14 days quarantine is politically sustainable long-term solution. Because at some point Australians will have to accept that COVID-19 is going to be an ongoing fact of life. It will be endemic. For those millions of Melburnians who have persevered through one of the longest lockdowns in the world, and many others, they're going to ask, was it worth it? Why did we deprive so many people of their liberty and send so many businesses broke? Why did we rack up $1 trillion in government debt? So the explanations to these very important questions are going to require acute political messaging skills. I don't know how Scott Morrison and Greg Hunt are going to pull it off. But in his 2.5 years in office, the Prime Minister has done something remarkable that suggests he can. He's the first Liberal leader since John Howard to crack the code of governing from the centre-right. While Newspoll only has the government 2 points ahead of the opposition, the poll understates its dominance of the political landscape. Morrison has emerged as the leading political figure of his generation. His folksy charm has won over Australians. He seeks to be a unifying force. He revels in the image of the middle-class patriot and has rejected the partisanship of Abbott, the elitism of Turnbull, and the class of Downer. And whether it's real or not, it's effective. It works. And one of the ironies is that his opponent, Anthony Albanese, should have the natural authenticity advantage, given that he rose from a single-parent housing commission family to briefly become Deputy Prime Minister. The reasons for this have as much to do with circumstance and Morrison's persona as Albanese's performance. And the Labor leader has been unable to convince the commentariat that he is a credible alternative Prime Minister. There seems to be only room for one earthy bloke at the top of Australian politics. So unless Albanese gets some lucky break and the political winds start to blow his way, one of the perennial themes of this year in politics will be whether the Labor Party will replace its leader. This story is in danger of becoming a media-created vampire, one that will not die until a leadership pretender drives a stake through its heart by mounting a challenge. Personally, I think Bob Hawke would struggle to be a popular opposition leader against Morrison in these circumstances. And to its detriment, it seems that the Labor Party hasn't accepted the lessons of the 2019 election, which made it clear that the marginal voter doesn't want higher taxes or bigger government. The Labor Party still refuses to answer some fundamental questions about what it believes in, including whether corporate and personal income taxes should be lower and the economic cost of greenhouse gas abatement. Perhaps Labor will be better off deciding what it believes in instead of replacing its leader. Not only what it believes in, but giving its leader a chance to sell a clear vision. Now, if there was a leadership change, no doubt a new leadership team would receive a short-term publicity boost. Consider the options though. Tanya Plibersek is an inner-city MP whose whole career has been spent pursuing social causes advanced by the left. How would she win over Queensland and Hunter Valley coal miners, or northern Tasmanian farmers, or tradesmen in Melbourne's outer suburbs? Jim Chambers, often quoted as the other leading leadership contender, is from the right in Queensland. Now, while Chalmers has a lot of experience as a political advisor, he's never been a minister or run a large organisation. Plibersek herself was in cabinet less than 2 years. So while both are talented and decent individuals, I don't see that they have at this stage the gravitas, the experience, or the public profiles needed to defeat someone as entrenched as Scott Morrison. The other contenders have their own problems too. Bill Shorten's already lost 2 elections, and Joel Fitzgibbon doesn't really have the profile or the experience, I think, to unite the party. And as a proud pragmatist, Scott Morrison is a very dangerous opponent. Now, Morrison's decision to end decades of Liberal Party commitment to budget discipline demonstrates that he will not let principle stand in the way of winning. His masterful rhetorical position on climate change shows he knows how to frame a debate to his own advantage. I read on the front page of The Australian on the weekend that the political debate about reaching a carbon neutral future is over. It's not about the how, it's now about the how, not about the if, Morrison was quoted saying. It's not about the politics anymore, it's about the technology. But there was a catch. Morrison said he wouldn't set a 2050 target for net zero emissions, unlike a lot of other countries in the OECD. Even China's got one. So we've got an objective, but no target. So Morrison has offered something to both sides of the debate while giving away nothing. That's brilliant politics, something the coalition government has shown it can pull off time and time again. So, given the political debate seems to be the political year ahead is likely to continue to go the government's way, maybe it should be the year when the government demonstrates that it can execute some difficult policy too, given the Prime Minister has said he wants to go full term, an election that's very latest can be held in September 2022. Well, Scott Morrison recently dismissed the introduction of the GST as, quote, just putting up a tax. So his commitment to serious reform seems to be lacking. For all our luck and wealth, that's a shame, because for all our luck and wealth, Australia faces major problems. Wages are stagnant, unemployment is higher than it should be, the retirement system perpetuates income inequality, workplaces are over-regulated, Indigenous advancement is stalled, and we're struggling to manage the relationship with our top trading partner. So that's the year ahead as I see it. But I'd like to mention just one personal anecdote which touched me recently. Last week I found out that my best friend from high school took his life 3 days before Christmas. Michael lived in a shared flat in inner city Melbourne. Last year, thanks to the COVID lockdown, he lost his job and was unable to see his mother and brother for 6 months. They were his only family in Australia. No doubt there are other decisions that contributed to his tragic decision. For me, though, his death is a reminder of why the protection of individual liberties is so important. Sometimes they're a matter of life and death. Thanks very much for listening.
Many thanks, Aaron, and now we come to Parnell and then on to questions and discussion. Thank you.
I'm so sorry to hear that story, Aaron. That's tragic. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Now, today's topic, Politics 2021, just fills me with dread. As a rule, predicting anything is fraught with danger. My very favourite book about political punditry is Philip Tetlock's Expert Political Judgment. His 20-year longitudinal study on expert commentators and political cognoscenti found that their predictions turned out to be no more accurate than chance, or as Tetlock colourfully expressed it, no more accurate than dart-throwing chimps. Today I'm the chimp, leaving my tarts on the historical record. But Tetlock did find one characteristic that ever so slightly improved the accuracy of pundits. He adopted a quote from Isaiah Berlin to describe this characteristic. And Berlin had it from a quote from the poet Archilochus. A fox knows many things, but a hedgehog only knows one big thing. Berlin's hedgehogs relate everything to a single central vision. His foxes entertain ideas that are centrifugal rather than centripetal. They consider many experiences and objects without seeking to fit them into any one changing or all-embracing inner vision. Tetlock found that foxes were slightly but significantly better than hedgehogs at making forecasts, which is a long way of saying that I'm not going to attempt to make grand predictions or reveal some essential truth. Instead, I'm going to draw your attention to a number of currents, big and small, which might influence the course of Australian politics this year. I've tried to limit myself only to points which haven't already been widely examined. Broadly, they fit into three categories: observations on the Prime Minister and the federal opposition leader, some ticking time bombs in the policy sphere, and the social context. As the polls keep telling us, Australians believe Prime Minister Scott Morrison has handled the coronavirus pandemic very well. Sadly, 909 Australians have died with or from the disease, but this is still a tiny number in comparison to other nations. At the same time, many sectors of the economy were able to remain open. Cushioned by a $500 billion pandemic response, Australians are riding out the COVID in relative comfort. In responding to the pandemic, Morrison once again showed himself in tune with the quiet Australians. The vast majority of Australians are not traders or travellers. It produces no inconvenience to them if borders are closed internally and externally. According to one survey, 40% of Australians never travel overseas. Another 23% only do so once or twice every few years. And only 18% of Australians travel once a year or more. This means there's very little voter pressure on Morrison to open up borders again. Indeed, with an election coming toward the end of this year or early next, there's every reason not to allow travel. The political downside of an increase in community cases of COVID would be more powerful than the political upside of taking the risk. It's notable that Morrison recently praised as wise the extreme caution of Queensland Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk, who ordered a long weekend lockdown after one case of the more contagious strain of COVID was contracted by a hotel quarantine worker. Palaszczuk, like Morrison, is happy to keep her borders shut as long as she considers necessary or expedient. But Australia can't stay closed forever. We need the revenue the world brings more than ever. In 2019, the tourism industry was worth $60 billion to Australia, and the education industry raked in almost $40 billion. These industries are a significant source of revenue, and consumer spending, which the economy, especially the small business economy, is missing. It was easy to shut Australia off. This year we will find out whether Morrison is equal to the task of opening up again. Inevitably, comparisons will be drawn between the extremely cautious approach he looks locked into and the bolder course taken by New South Wales. Morrison has publicly admired New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian's ability to manage infection risk while keeping the New South Wales economy as open as possible. But he doesn't look inclined to replicate it. New South Wales has used the upheaval of the pandemic to embark on a raft of policy reforms that it believes will position it for future economic strength. In April 2020, Morrison also made much of the need for reform. In April 2020, Morrison also made much of the need for reforms to support Australia's pandemic recovery. While waving about the Productivity Commission's 2017 Shifting the Dial report, he declared that everything is on the table. As we approach the anniversary of that declaration, no dial has been shifted, and it looks like no productivity dividends will be forthcoming. Morrison's planned reform agenda is now reduced to industrial relations reform. Even this looks likely to get stymied by the unions and weaponised by the opposition. That would leave the Prime Minister with no significant reforms when the need to improve productivity is obvious and acute. It also poses a communications challenge as well as a political challenge, because the government needs positive stories as it gears up for an election. They've already blown much of their existing artillery. The Morrison government has a bad habit of publicly patting itself on the back by giving friendly journalists the inside story, often before the results are fully known. The pay-in to the now defunct COVID Save app was a particularly cringe-worthy example. Other than making for a lot of boring journalism, naturally not from our friend Aaron, as the press gallery is spoon-fed by self-congratulatory ministerial media teams, it means that many of the puff pieces the government should be placing, like breadcrumbs up to the ballot box, are already yesterday's bird food. So it's possible to envisage a scenario in which the New South Wales reforms lead to a thriving state economy, and the state's success leaves the Prime Minister looking comparatively ineffective. The good management stories of 2020 will be long forgotten. Labor and the unions will set their internecine troubles aside in order to fight against Work Choices 2.0, a familiar battle on familiar ground, which they hope will defeat Morrison as its predecessor defeated Prime Minister John Howard. The fight would be a charm for Anthony Albanese, who's between a rock and a hard place trying to appeal to traditional Labor constituencies, while appeasing the climate aspirations and culture war demands of the left of the Labor Party. He would welcome any kind of opportunity to step into a traditional skirmish of the old Labor kind. Industrial relations reform may be the policy bomb ticking the loudest. After all, the government's credibility in business circles hangs in the balance. But there are plenty of other time bombs which preceded the pandemic and are ready to blow. Thanks to the good ministrations of former Treasurer Peter Costello, every 5 years Treasury produces a report on the long-term sustainability of current government policies and how changes to Australia's population size and age profile may impact on the economic performance, workforce and public finances over the next 40 years. The most recent report was due in 2020, but was delayed so it could incorporate the significant changes to the budget that the COVID response has occasioned. It's now due out in the middle of this year. In 2015, the Intergenerational Report found that the number of Australians aged 65 and over will double by 2054, with 1 in 1,000 people projected to be over the age of 100. By way of comparison, in 1975 there was only 1 person in 10,000 over the age of 100. Australia's demographic outlook has not improved since the last report. The 2015 report assumed that the birth rate would continue at 1.9 births per woman. In 2019, births per woman were down to 1.7. That creates what some have referred to as an impending demographic mushroom cloud, a situation in which there are dwindling numbers of taxpayers supporting a growing number of tax consumers, that is, elderly people, who require more health services and government pensions. The release of the Intergenerational Report is traditionally greeted with a rise in intergenerational hostility, as younger people are reminded of the financial burden that awaits them, while they're already struggling to afford a house and maybe even a baby. One consequence, of course, will be more of the OK Boomer and Karen Call the Manager memes. More gravely, the 2021 Intergenerational Report will bring home just how much debt there is for young people to pay off. We'll see if the government's determination to save every life, no matter what the cost, is still popular among young people once they're presented with the bill for each boomer. The reminder of our demographic pinch point will also reopen the discussion around migration to Australia. Migrants have, for the past decades, been our primary source of population growth. But before COVID, migration levels had become a concern for many Australians, with around 60% of less affluent Australians believing the intake was too high. In 2020, Australia's migrant intake dropped by 80%, down from 154,000 to 31,000. Setting a new migration cap could become a source of considerable political contention this year. Of course, young people could simply decide that modern monetary theory, a fashionable name for printing more money, will push debt repayments into the never-never, onto the children they might not have, in which case why not spend more? JobSeeker is scheduled to return to its pre-pandemic New Start rate in March this year. There's already a strong case that the previous New Start rate was not enough to support someone actually looking for a job. The JobSeeker top-up will be a painful loss to many people who've learned to enjoy and rely on the extra money. This political landmine could simply be skirted by leaving JobSeeker at a higher rate. But then some businesses have claimed that the higher rate makes potential employees reluctant to accept employment that leaves them no better off financially. It will be difficult to find a path out of these conflicting pressures without a discussion about what welfare seeks to achieve and whether our punitive welfare system is adequately structured to achieve it. The entire welfare system needs an overhaul to nip intergenerational disadvantage in the bud. That would be another inconvenient distraction for the government, though it may prove inevitable. Another area of policy which the government does not want to get bogged down in, but which is overdue and possibly unavoidable, is the question of an Indigenous voice to Parliament, or some form of breakthrough in the Indigenous space. At the end of 2020, a survey by Reconciliation Australia claimed that over 80% of Australians were in favour of a constitutionally enshrined voice. The year before, an Essential poll had found 70% in favour. So it would seem that there's widespread support for the notion, at least in theory. Certainly there's enough activist support to ensure the issue won't just disappear from the national consciousness, though it's unlikely to be sufficient to sell constitutional change to Australians. There'll be pressure to do more in the Indigenous space. Moreover, the Liberal Party would be missing a major opportunity to write a new narrative for itself if the first Indigenous Minister for Indigenous Australians is not supported to rack up at least one major accomplishment. An unlikely ally in this area might be former Prime Minister Tony Abbott. The Institute of Public Affairs announced yesterday that Abbott would join the think tank as Distinguished Fellow, fighting for mainstream Australian values. Indigenous disadvantage has long been an issue close to Abbott's heart. As Prime Minister, he pledged to spend a week each year in a remote Indigenous community, effectively giving communities a direct voice into the PM's ear. In the context of his appointment to the IPA, he again mentioned his interest in Indigenous affairs. He would be well positioned in his new role to help the government create an acceptable model for a voice to Parliament, and to advocate for it among those who remain sceptical of its value. Abbott's IPA role will also introduce an interesting twist into the culture wars. In seeking election the first time, Scott Morrison refused to engage in the culture wars, which had ravaged the Liberal Party as Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull fought for control and leadership of the party. Since being elected, Morrison has governed pragmatically and moderately, often to the irritation of those on the right of the party, who believe that the left is winning the culture war. Now a high-profile former Prime Minister will be stepping into the culture war fray. This may work well for the government, as the culture wars will be waged at arm's length. Or it could work out poorly, if Abbott's focus shifts from influencing culture upstream from politics to influencing politics itself. The latter would draw the Liberal Party back into the turmoil of the last decade. This could work out well for the Labor Party, which has been struggling with its own internal culture wars, and would welcome the distraction. And with that, I believe I've just about used up my time. Of course, this is a tiny, tiny selection of the cross-currents that will run through politics in 2021, and a few ideas on the ways in which they could affect its broader course. I haven't even touched on important issues brewing overseas, or many of the debates which are raging in Australia as we speak. But hopefully, in the spirit of Tetlock, I've contributed a few ideas to the foxes in the audience who know many things that make them ever so slightly better at anticipating the future. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks for two very informative papers. Now, I follow Parnell's position, which I think is yours as well, Aaron, that you're not into making predictions, but what are the options for an early election apart from the timing? What would be, let's start with you, Parnell, what would be the advantages of going earlier than might be expected? Because as Aaron points out, the government could go as late as September next year. What would be the advantages of going earlier? What are the disadvantages, and what do you think, Patrick?
Well, I think that obviously the advantage of going earlier is that they'd still have the popularity boost that they've gotten, that Morrison has from managing the COVID pandemic. They would be aware that at some point, as JobKeeper and all of the funding tails off, the popularity is going to take a hit. So I guess if they were planning to do that, what I would expect to see is subsidies extended in March. There would be a much softer tapering off, and therefore a much better run-up to an early election. Again, this is not a prediction, just a gut feel. My gut feel is they won't do it. That there is too much baggage associated with going early. There are too many recent examples of that not turning out well. From Theresa May, from all of the strategists working with Morrison have seen a number of ways that early elections aren't successful elections. So my feeling is that they will wait until next year. But of course, there is so much that can happen in between times that changes everything. As I said, there are so many there are so many fights brewing, and this is why they're keeping their options open so that they don't need to make that call. I doubt, frankly, that there is a definite idea of what's going to happen even within the coalition at the moment. I think that they would be keeping their fingers on the pulse and keeping everything ready, preparing for it, with the assumption that they might press go at any time.
And Aaron, do the advantages outweigh disadvantages in any area here, or we just don't know?
They could, Jared. I think clearly Morrison's a complete opportunist, and so if he sees if there's a significant change in the political environment, which I think he feels has got a chance he can exploit, I don't think he could rule it out. So definitely agree with Parnell that I think we should take Morrison at his word that he wants to go full term, and that has the great effect of helping stay off helping stay off election speculation, which is a distraction to him and the party room. At the same time, you could see a scenario where eventually the Labor Party gets sick of Albanese, decides to overrule its own rules, replace him without the vote of the membership, puts in a young team, and then something goes wrong, or pretty quickly the honeymoon doesn't last. So you go and say that an Albanese plebiscite leadership combination, which I think would be particularly weak, and I assume the Prime Minister's office has wargamed already, or is wargaming. And so
you said, did you say an Albanese plebiscite?
Sorry, I meant a Chalmers
plebiscite, yeah.
I meant a Chalmers plebiscite leadership ticket. Not sure who would be in the number one spot, presumably Chalmers, being from the right. But let's say Labor does that. They get a honeymoon period. The government switches gears in terms of political attack. It finds a point of weakness there to go them. It starts running ads saying, do you want this left-winger and this untested bloke really running the country? We've given you 10 years of solid leadership. Everything changes, the political environment, and the government thinks, okay, we're going to win this easily. There's no point holding off. Let's pull the trigger. I can imagine a scenario like that. Look, I have a different take on how COVID will play out to Parnell, obviously. She's more sanguine about the political implications of the closed border than I am. I'm just really interested to hear her view on that. And so that plays into it too. So if Parnell's scenario is right, that means that the political pressure of closed borders is much less acute than the way I'm seeing it. Okay? And so that really depends upon when do Australians get sick of knocking overseas? Do you have stories about the split in families?
Yeah.
I know a family where father's in London and mother's in Sydney, and the father desperately to see his two daughters. And if stories like that can change things. But as Parnell makes a very strong point that a lot of Australians don't need to travel overseas, and so definitely that could prolong the appetite for a border closure.
So you've got this issue about the virus, COVID-19, and then divisions within both Labor and the coalition. By the coalition, of course, I'm talking about the Nationals and the Liberals, broadly over climate change. You've seen this issue within the coalition right now about what attitude should be to coal, as one instance of that. And in the Labor Party with the different position taken by Joel Fitzgibbon, and who as you know, is a regional-based prominent Labor figure, used to be a front bencher, now a back bencher, but a very prominent one, and the city-based, mainly city-based Labor activist, political activist. So how's that going to work out? Because you've got, on a similar issue, not an identical issue, but a similar issue, you've got divisions between the two major political parties and within the two major political parties.
Well, my perception, Jared, is that the divisions are more acute in the Labor Party on the left side of politics, mainly because the government won the election in part because of Labor's climate policies. And the right of the Labor Party know this, and Joel Fitzgibbon knows this, and he wants to pull back their policy. So I think the political problems is much more serious for Labor than that, and they still haven't reconciled that point. And for me, this is one of the greatest weaknesses in Albanese's leadership, that he's been unable to bring them to a politically advantageous position on this. Incredibly difficult to do, and more difficult for a left-winger than a right-winger. And I remember on election night, 2019, you had, after the polls closed, Penny Wong saying on television, I think it was the ABC, this is great, this just shows how the issue of climate change is coming our way. And she was so wrong. So to me, the really strong pro-coal lobby in the National Party, which I guess is epitomised by Matt Canavan, as versus, say, a Trent Zimmerman, who's very, very green on this. I think the LNP's done a better job at managing the internal debate, and I think he gets a lot of criticism in the media, but Angus Taylor seems to have helped steer the party to a kind of a compromise where they say all the right things for a lot of people, which is we accept climate change. You know, they can't. The critics have not been able to make the climate skeptic label stick on them. So, in a sense, they've neutralised that perception largely that they are climate skeptics, which Tony Abbott could never do. At the same time, they're saying all the right things about we've got to go to hydrogen, okay, and gas is the transition fuel. They don't talk about coal, they don't get up, and no one's taking coal into Parliament anymore, okay? Yeah. And so, but they aren't really doing anything. They aren't really doing anything. You know, we're still, what, the world's biggest or second biggest coal exporter. We're still the world's largest LNG exporter, and so we should be, you know. And so I think environment and climate is one of the best examples of why Morrison's such a successful leader in the way that Abbott and Turnbull weren't.
So you're saying this is about management, because the division between Mr. Zimmerman and Senator Canavan wouldn't be any greater than the division between Fitzgibbon and Butler, Mark Butler, would it, on the Labor side, except it's better managed and it's not so much out in the public.
Well, as Aaron says, it's better managed because they're in government. There's much more incentive to keep your head down and behave. But, of course, what we saw this morning with Barnaby Joyce writing an op-ed in The Australian, arguing for building new power stations and essentially putting the coalition, the Nationals Liberal Alliance, on the line for it, could change everything if Joyce can get enough support in the National Party to really carry that through. Clearly, the National Party feels like it's not being listened to, it's not being taken along for a ride, and they could go down the route of the Abbott-Turnbull sort of wars, which clearly used climate as a weapon to achieve a political end within the party.
But this was said before the last election, wasn't it, that McCormack, as the Nationals leader, the Deputy Prime Minister, was floundering. Yeah. But in effect, the Nationals did reasonably well in that election. McCormack did okay, and it wasn't as bad as his critics thought. So his prospects, they can't leave the government because they lose all their ministerial seats. So Joyce can say that, he being a backbencher, but McCormack seems to be holding them together reasonably well.
Well, I don't see any evidence that the Nationals are imploding under Michael McCormack. Now, I think what you've got here is an ex-leader who's very charismatic and entertaining, versus a current leader who is probably a bit boring. But there's also something to be said for a boring leader of the National Party. Someone who can work well in government, who gets along with the Prime Minister, has a good working relationship with them, and is doing most of his work out there in regional Australia, as opposed to appearing on 7:30 every second night because he said something that outrages the ABC.
Yes, the thing is, McCormack isn't working the media terribly effectively. So he is... all of the farmers I've spoken to can't stand him. Sorry, Michael. And part of the reason is that he doesn't use Sky very effectively. He doesn't use those platforms that reach out into the bush terribly effectively. Barnaby still does, and Barnaby sort of hits some notes that get those constituents excited. So he can get quite a few people interested. It might not translate into votes because, of course, television doesn't sort of segment by electorates neatly. It just gets a sort of a bit of a head on, of a bit of a head of steam on. But that's where McCormack sort of really, just for some reason or another, hasn't quite understood or managed to change, to work the position that he's in and use the media available to him to look like an active and, to show how active he is as National Party leader. Because you're right, he's effective in person, he's incredibly engaging. He's just not very good at the media side of things.
But he held the vote.
As I say.
Last time he held the vote.
That's right.
So even if all the farmers don't like him, some of them must be voting for him.
So that's absolutely right. So there's that. The farmers don't like him. The ones who watch Sky don't like him very much. But sure, his electorate seems to like him just fine. And a lot of women in the National Party like Barnaby Joyce even less.
Also, it's worth bearing in mind that this government has been pretty good for farmers. This government's thrown money at them. Through the drought, and they have a very privileged place in the economy, and farming in Australia is a really lucrative business.
And rural prices are high.
Rural prices are high. There's about $5.5 billion in these tax shelters called farm management deposits. They've done very well financially during the pandemic. So country Australia is not struggling, despite what you might read in the Telegraph.
They're struggling to get their money out at a tax rate that they find friendly enough. That's the issue.
But they have nowhere much to go if you're alienated. I mean, even if, as you say, many farmers oppose Mr. McCormack, I mean, they've got nowhere much to go, have they? I mean,
No.
Where would they go?
Well, what about the Shooters, Farmers and Fishers Party or One Nation? These parties on the right. And you see in New South Wales, they've made big encroachments. I think the Shooters, Farmers and Fishers have got 3 seats, have they? And One Nation's got one in the lower house in New South Wales.
And a high-profile Mark Latham in the upper house, who's now moved to Newcastle.
Mark Latham's moved to Newcastle from Campton.
I understand so, yeah. Well, that's where he got a strong vote. In the Hunter Valley, that's where One Nation got a strong vote in the New South Wales election. So I understand he's moved there. He was certainly talking from there last night on Sky News.
Right, well, that's
I think Latham's got the opposite problem. Latham's too much of a media personality to make an effect with the farmers, because there is a large part of the vote which really just wants people who deal with water or, make a difference on very specific issues, and they don't even know what the classifications of the parties are. They don't know One Nation from Shooters, Fishers or Farmers from Nationals. They know the name of the person who helps them out with local issues.
Or One Nation is strong, and Mark Latham is strong much more in the Hunter Valley with the miners and the families of the miners and related small businesses, whereas the farmers, fishers and shooters are stronger in the more rural areas. So yes, they've posed a problem in New South Wales, not so much outside of New South Wales. It always is a problem for the main rural party to have someone coming at it from the side with a kind of rural interest. And what about One Nation? That's making some impact still in Queensland, but not much outside of Queensland.
Well, in New South Wales, Mark Latham has, I think, developed a new model for One Nation, which is, perhaps we should call it the sensible redneck, which is, because he understands how government works and his good policy brain, he's able to engage on quite a sophisticated level in all of the policy issues, and he's been able to establish some credibility for One Nation into areas like education. And he's also been very relentless at attacking the Liberal government. And he had this filibuster, this great publicity stunt recently, where he forced the Legislative Council to go all night in debating the the energy plan to increase renewable energy significantly in New South Wales, perhaps the most ambitious energy plan at a state level in all of Australia.
Yes.
And so, in that sense, I think Mark Latham has shown just how an individual, charismatic and politically savvy leader can be really important for these minor parties, but those people are so few and far between. Clearly, in its federal leadership, One Nation doesn't have that level of sophistication and hasn't been able to develop at a state level either.
Looking at One Nation, it seems both in Queensland, Pauline Hanson here in New South Wales, where Mark Latham's the most influential figure, it seems likely that these days probably more of their preferences would go to the coalition than perhaps was the case with Pauline Hanson 20 years ago, because they're probably more hostile to Labor than they are to Morrison. Does that make sense?
Theoretically it does, but it doesn't always play out like that from what I've seen. So I haven't delved into it deeply, but again, there is the Labor in Queensland is a bit different to Labor in New South Wales. So they're better in tune with providing that alternative, and people voting One Nation more and more aren't just people who are disaffected by Liberals who have been looking for an alternative. They're looking for something else entirely. But then that's also the flip side of that, is that what we saw around the world before COVID was all of the minor parties picking up votes on the basis that people were looking for an alternative. And there's been a sort of a move away from that, actually even a little bit before COVID. There was a move towards the centre again. So you see it in Germany, you see it in Australia, and certainly in the UK. Well, with Boris Johnson's handling, that might reverse again. They might end up back with UKIP. But there was a sort of a coming back to the major parties which could do things.
In your comment in your speech, Aaron, you, as you know, the usual focus about the last election and winning the next election turns a lot on Queensland, but you made the point in your speech, which a lot of people overlook, which is Northern Tasmania. Morrison won 2 seats in Northern Tasmania in the last election from Labor, probably would have won a third, except for Lyons as well as Bass and Braddon, except for a problem with a candidate just before the election. So that's another base where Morrison's moved into an area where the Liberals haven't done particular. Tony Abbott did okay there, and also in the early days of the Fraser government did okay there. But Morrison might well hold that base in Northern Tasmania, which makes it, I mean, Labor's really got to win seats in Queensland, probably, and in Northern Tasmania as well to break through.
Well, this raised a really interesting point, Jared, which is, could the next election lead to an increased majority for the government? And one way that would have to happen is they have to hold Queensland, and you could argue they're at a high water mark in Queensland, so that might be more challenging for them. Okay. The other one is, could they pick up an extra seat in Northern Tasmania and hold it? Well, I think one of the interesting scenarios could be is, well, do they perhaps try and win back Warringah by putting up a far left Liberal candidate? Maybe Matt Keane, the state energy minister. And then you would have a very interesting dynamic where you're using a combination of from the right and from the left to increase your majority. And I think, I agree with you, we shouldn't make predictions, but I think you've got to consider that as a possible scenario.
Which is Joel Fitzgibbon worry as well in relation to central New South Wales, that Labor could lose seats there as well.
Yes, and also what have you got? Gilmore down on the south coast of New South Wales, which Labor held. Now you had a very messy coalition campaign with Warren Mundine running there, and also
those who ran against him, because you had the Liberals split. You had the Nationals running against Warren Mundine, so you had a complete internal mess, which won't be there next time.
You did. So you look at all these different minor regional variances, and if you say then maintain a sort of, you accept that there isn't a major political disturbance in terms of the party's level of support, you can easily see a scenario where Morrison increases his majority, which is what I think the Hawke government did it in its third election victory.
Third election, yeah. Now we're going to finish up fairly soon, but I just want to get you towards the end after we just cover this one issue, but your views on China, not that there's any answer, but just what your views about the Australia-China relationship is. But Parnell, the Greens, they've done okay, but they haven't processed much beyond about 10% of the national vote, and they've won. They've done okay in the Senate. They've got one seat in the Reps. They probably haven't done as much as some people would have thought, say, 10 years ago. So how do you see the Greens? Are they stabilising? Can they move
They're
forward?
an absolute disaster. Australian Greens are a joke. And a great example of why this is in Germany, the Green Party is actually in contention to put up the next Chancellor. So there's talk that they might win enough votes to, once Angela Merkel steps down, that in some form of coalition they would be powerful enough to have the Chancellor candidate. Now, compare that to the Australian Greens, who have consistently failed to behave like a party who might at some point win government, and so therefore will never. And they've actually moved further away from power, it seems to me, over the last decade. Certainly since Bob Brown stepped down, and Bob, for all of his faults, very dynamic person who knew where the party was going and where he wanted to take it. At least gave it that direction. I don't believe there's anybody in the Greens at the moment who has that sort of intellectual heft, let alone that sort of drive or even plenty of ambition, I'm sure, but very little strategy to put it into action.
Do you want to add to that?
Well, look, the Greens, I completely agree with Parnell. The Greens are a little bit of a threat to the Labor's left in the inner city. You particularly see that in Melbourne. And I think that is probably their greatest political opportunity, is if Albanese or whoever replaces him can solidify the Labor Party in the right. That, I think, creates an open door for the Greens to exploit.
So that would mean a couple of extra seats in the lower house, sort of tops.
At best.
At best. So just conclude on China, not there's any answers, but the Australian relationship with China, how bad is it? Can it get better? Can it get worse? Let's start with Parnell.
I think it's a really interesting one at the moment. So the Xi Jinping speech to the World Economic Forum just yesterday or the day before was a really interesting sort of back down from the strong China approach that he'd been taking to all of a sudden casting China as the victim. The West was bullying them. It's the bullying of the strong on the weak and so on. Now, of course, there's a different message internally. Of course, he's not saying that internally. But the fact that he has decided to change tack, I found interesting. I think that there might be a little realisation that they're being pushed hard at the moment. That if they push back too hard on the West right now, it won't come to their advantage if they keep up their sort of bullying act. Mind you, they haven't changed anything on trade policy with Australia, which is one of the chief ways that it manifests. But the change in language might be a precursor to some sort of shift in that area. I mean, how long it would last, whether anyone would believe it. Of course, everybody at the World Economic Forum believes it's 100%. Whether Australia or any other country would believe China anymore, given its behaviour, is another question entirely.
Aaron?
It strikes me that Australia's challenge of dealing with China is marrying up its interests versus its values. And clearly our interest is to have no conflict with China, which requires dealing with an upcoming superpower, a degree of putting aside our values as a democratic nation. And democracies like ourselves struggle, I think, to deal with autocratic countries which don't respect rule of law or human rights. And it's an incredibly challenging relationship to manage because of that. And it's hard. It's very hard because we have such an important economic relationship with a country which imprisons its own people on a mass scale. And I think it's one for the ethicists more than the political commentators, to be honest.
Well, since you've ruled yourself out of the discussion at this stage, it's quite a good spot to conclude. Look, thanks for a stimulating discussion. Well done to Aaron Patrick, well done to Parnell, McGuinness. I'm sure you'll be back here again, but thanks for starting off 2021 at the Sydney Institute for us.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.